The shotgun blast that tore through the afternoon silence sent Katherine Malone diving behind the rain barrel, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She pressed her palm against the splintered wood, gasping for breath as another shot rang out from inside the saloon where she had been washing glasses just moments before. The year was 1884, and Bisbee, Arizona territory had proven itself far more dangerous than the advertisement promising good wages and honest work had suggested when she'd answered it 3 months ago. Katherine had arrived in this copper mining town with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the clothes on her back, fleeing a past in Missouri that still haunted her dreams. At 22 years old, she'd already survived more hardship than most women twice her age, but survival was all she'd managed. Living, truly living, seemed like a luxury reserved for people whose names meant something, whose families had left them more than just scars and bad memories. The shooting inside the Desert Rose Saloon continued, and Katherine knew she couldn't stay crouched behind the barrel forever. She gathered her skirts and ran, her worn boots kicking up dust as she fled down the wooden sidewalk. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat. Miners and townsfolk scattered, seeking cover, while a few brave souls drew their own weapons and moved toward the saloon. Katherine didn't stop running until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. She found herself on the edge of town, near where the buildings gave way to scrubland and distant mountains. A wagon loaded with supplies sat outside the general store, and she leaned against it, trying to catch her breath and figure out what to do next. She couldn't go back to the saloon, not after this. The owner, Cyrus Webb, had already made it clear that trouble meant dismissal, and a gunfight in his establishment certainly qualified. "You all right, miss?" The voice was deep and concerned, with a slight Texas drawl that softened the edges. Katherine looked up and found herself staring at a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty work shirt, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, green with flecks of gold. His dark hair needed a trim, curling slightly over his collar, and his tanned face bore the weathered look of someone who spent his days under the open sky. He appeared to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, and he watched her with an expression that seemed genuinely worried rather than merely curious. "I'm fine," Katherine managed, though her voice shook. "There was trouble at the saloon, shooting." The man frowned, glancing back toward the main street where the gunfire had finally ceased. "Were you hurt?" "No, I just needed to get away." She straightened, suddenly aware of how she must look, her blonde hair escaping its pins, her simple brown dress dusty and wrinkled. "I should go." "Go where?" he asked, not unkindly. "If you were working at the Desert Rose, Webb's not going to want you back today, not with whatever mess is happening there." Katherine felt her chest tighten. "I know, I just don't know where else to go." The man studied her for a long moment, and Katherine forced herself to meet his gaze despite wanting to look away. She'd learned that looking away made people think you were weak or guilty, and while she might have been many things, she refused to be seen as either. "My name is Ethan Vance," he said finally. "I run a ranch about 6 miles west of here. It's not fancy, but it's honest work raising cattle and breaking horses. My cook quit last week, headed back east to live with her daughter. I've been making do with beans and hardtack, which is about the extent of my culinary skills. You know anything about cooking?" Hope flickered in Katherine's chest, small but persistent. "I can cook. I'm better at it than serving drinks, truth be told. Can you ride a horse?" "Well enough to stay in the saddle." Ethan nodded slowly, seeming to make up his mind about something. "I can offer you room and board plus $30 a month. The work's hard, The days are long and it's just me and two ranch hands most of the time. It's isolated and some might say lonely, but it's safe and the pay is fair. You interested?" Katherine knew she should ask more questions, should be cautious about going off with a stranger to an isolated ranch. But something in Ethan Vance's steady gaze made her feel like this might be the first honest offer she'd received since leaving Missouri. Besides, her options were limited to non-existent at the moment. "I'm interested," she said quietly. "You got belongings you need to collect?" "A room above the saloon. My things are there." Ethan glanced toward the main street again. "Tell you what, you stay here with the wagon and I'll go see about collecting your things. Which room?" "Second door on the left upstairs. But you don't have to do that." "Can't have you going back there if there's still trouble," Ethan said simply. He was already moving toward his horse, a sturdy bay gelding tied near the general store. "I'll be back shortly. Don't run off." There was something almost teasing in that last comment, and Katherine found herself managing a small smile despite everything. She watched Ethan ride back toward the center of town, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. While she waited, Katherine tried to process the sudden turn her life had taken. An hour ago, she'd been washing glasses and dodging the grabby hands of drunk miners. Now, she was apparently headed to a ranch to work as a cook for a man she'd just met. It should have terrified her more than it did, but somehow the prospect of leaving Bisbee behind, even temporarily, felt like relief. True to his word, Ethan returned within 20 minutes, her carpetbag tied to his saddle. The shooting had been over a card game, he explained, and one man was dead while another was being held by the territorial marshal. The saloon was closed for the day while they sorted out the mess. "Webb said to tell you not to bother coming back," Ethan added, his expression sympathetic. "Said he's closing the place for a week anyway while repairs are made." Katherine nodded, having expected nothing less. "Thank you for getting my things. Let's get you out to the ranch before it gets dark," Ethan said, handing her the carpetbag before climbing onto the wagon seat. He offered her his hand, and Katherine took it, feeling the callous strength of his grip as he helped her up beside him. The ride out of Bisbee gave Katherine her first real look at the Arizona landscape. Red rock formations jutted against the brilliant blue sky, and the scrubland stretched out in shades of brown and green, dotted with mesquite and creosote bushes. Mountains rose in the distance, purple-blue in the afternoon light. It was harsh country, unforgiving to those unprepared for it, but there was a stark beauty to it that Katherine found herself responding to. Ethan didn't press her with questions during the ride, for which Katherine was grateful. Instead, he pointed out landmarks, a particular rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, the dry creek bed that became a raging river during the summer monsoons, the distant ridge where he'd once spotted a mountain lion watching his cattle. "How long have you had the ranch?" Katherine asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Going on 5 years now. My father left me a little money when he passed, and I used it to buy the land and some starter stock. It's been hard work building it up, but it's mine. Nobody can take that from me." There was quiet pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who'd created something with his own hands. "What about your mother? She died when I was 12. Fever took her one winter. It was just me and my father after that, until he got thrown from a horse and broke his neck when I was 23. Ethan's hands were steady on the reins, his voice matter-of-fact rather than sad. Grief, when it was old enough, became just another fact to live with. "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. "It was 7 years ago. The pain fades, though I still miss him." Ethan glanced at her. "What about you? You got family back wherever you came from?" Katherine stiffened slightly. "No, no family." Something in her tone must have warned Ethan off because he didn't pursue the subject. Instead, he pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings was becoming visible. That's home. The Vance ranch wasn't large, but it was well kept. The main house was built of adobe and wood, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. A barn stood nearby, along with a smaller building that Katherine guessed was the bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Corrals held several horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the sparse grass. Two men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached. One was older, probably in his 50s, with gray streaking his dark hair and a weathered face that had seen hard years. The other was younger, maybe Katherine's age, with sandy hair and an easy smile. "Found yourself a new cook, boss," the younger one called out. "Miss Katherine Malone, meet Jack Peterson and Tom Grady," Ethan said, bringing the wagon to a stop. "They keep this place running when I've got my head in the clouds." "Pleasure, miss," Jack said, tipping his hat. He had warm brown eyes and a friendly demeanor that immediately put Katherine at ease. Tom, the older hand, simply nodded, his expression neutral. "We was wondering if you'd find someone before we all starved to death." "Tom's been threatening to quit over my cooking for a week now," Ethan said, climbing down from the wagon. He came around to help Katherine down, his hands firm at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. "Let me show you the house, Miss Malone." "Please, just Katherine," she said. The formality felt strange out here, miles from town and civilization. "Katherine it is, then." Ethan grabbed her carpet bag and led her toward the house. The interior was neat but sparse, clearly the domain of men who cared more about function than decoration. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace on one wall and a sturdy table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and the cookstove looked well used but properly maintained. "Your room is back here," Ethan said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a small but clean bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a washstand. A window looked out over the back of the property toward the mountains. "It's not much, but the mattress is decent and the roof doesn't leak." "It's perfect," Katherine said and meant it. She'd slept in far worse places, including a storage room at the Desert Rose that smelled perpetually of whiskey and tobacco. This room, with its clean sheets and the faint scent of sage blowing through the window, felt like a palace in comparison. Ethan set her carpet bag on the bed. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come on out when you're ready, and I'll show you where everything is in the kitchen. No pressure to start cooking today, though. We can make do with beans one more night." After he left, Katherine sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. Her hands were shaking, the aftermath of fear and adrenaline finally catching up with her. She'd been in Bisbee for 3 months, and in that time, she'd saved exactly $12 after paying for her room and meals. $12 to show for 3 months of work and wandering hands, and the constant low-level fear that came from being a woman alone in a mining town. This felt different. It felt like a chance. Katherine unpacked her meager belongings, hanging the 2 spare dresses she owned in the small wardrobe and arranging her few personal items on the dresser. A brush, a hand mirror with a crack across the glass, a small leather-bound book that had been her mother's, though Katherine rarely looked at it. She changed out of her dusty dress into the slightly less worn of her other 2, pinned her hair back properly, and splashed water on her face from the basin. When she emerged from the room, she found Ethan in the kitchen, pulling supplies from the pantry. He'd removed his hat, and his dark hair fell across his forehead as he moved. "Thought I'd show you what we have to work with," he said, not looking up. "It's mostly staples: flour, beans, salt pork, some dried beef." We get eggs from the chickens out back, and there's a vegetable garden that's struggling but producing a few things. Potatoes, some squash, tomatoes when they feel like cooperating in this heat. Katherine moved to his side, surveying the supplies with a practiced eye. I can work with this. Do you have any spices? Chili peppers, cumin, anything like that? Top shelf, left side. Ethan stepped back, watching as Katherine rose on her toes to reach the shelf. Her fingers found a collection of small jars and tins, and she pulled them down to examine the contents. This is good, she said, already mentally planning meals. I can make something decent with this. You don't have to start tonight, Ethan reminded her. You've had a rough day. Katherine met his eyes, finding genuine concern there. Cooking helps me think. And I'd rather earn my keep from the start. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a flicker of understanding or maybe respect. All right then, I'll get out of your way. Ring the bell on the porch when dinner's ready, and the hands will come running. Left alone in the kitchen, Katherine felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. This was something she knew how to do, something she was good at. Her mother had taught her to cook before the fever had taken her when Katherine was 15. After that, cooking had been one of the few skills that kept Katherine alive through the years that followed, though she tried not to think too hard about those years. She built up the fire in the stove and set to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Salt pork and beans might have been simple, but there were ways to make simple taste good. She diced up the salt pork and rendered it in a heavy pot, then added onions from the garden until they were soft and golden. The beans went in next, along with water and a careful blend of spices, a touch of chili powder for heat, cumin for earthiness, a bay leaf she found in one of the jars. While the beans simmered, Katherine made biscuits, cutting cold lard into flour and adding just enough buttermilk from the icebox to bring the dough together. She worked it gently, knowing that overworking would make them tough, and cut out rounds to go into the oven. The sun was setting by the time everything was ready, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible, too vivid to be real. Katherine rang the dinner bell as instructed, and within minutes, 3 hungry men appeared. The meal was eaten in relative silence, broken only by sounds of appreciation that made Katherine's chest feel warm. She'd always found satisfaction in feeding people, in the simple act of providing sustenance and comfort through food. "This is the best thing I've eaten in a month," Jack declared, reaching for his third biscuit. "No offense, boss." "None taken," Ethan said, his eyes finding Katherine's across the table. "I know my limitations in the kitchen." Tom, the quieter of the two hands, simply nodded his agreement, but the fact that he'd cleaned his plate twice spoke volumes. After dinner, the men returned to the bunkhouse while Katherine cleaned up the kitchen. She was drying the last dish when Ethan appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might want some," he said, offering her one. "We usually sit on the porch this time of evening. It's cooler and the view is something special." Katherine accepted the coffee and followed him outside. The temperature had indeed dropped with the sunset, and a light breeze carried the scent of sage and desert flowers. They sat in 2 worn chairs, and Katherine found herself relaxing for the first time all day. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "For dinner, I mean. It was more than good. It was like having a home-cooked meal again. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that." "It's my job now," Katherine said, but her tone was soft. "Maybe so, but there's a difference between cooking because you have to and cooking because you care about it. I could taste the difference tonight." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching the stars emerge. The sky out here, away from town lights, was a blanket of diamonds, more stars than Katherine had ever imagined existed. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Katherine tensed slightly. "All right. What were you running from when you came to Bisbee?" The question was direct but not unkind, and Katherine found herself appreciating the honesty of it. She could lie or deflect, or tell him it was none of his business. But something about the quiet darkness and Ethan's patient presence made her want to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "A man," she said finally, "in Missouri. He thought he owned me because his family had money and mine didn't. When I refused to marry him, he made sure everyone in town knew I was worthless, that I was nothing. His father was a judge, so there was no fighting it, no way to make anyone believe my side of things. I left because staying meant accepting what they said about me, and I couldn't do that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. What did they say? That I was a nobody. That I'd always be a nobody, that I came from nothing and would amount to nothing. Katherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I think they were right. They weren't." The certainty in Ethan's voice made Katherine turn to look at him. In the dim light from the house, she could just make out his profile, strong and steady. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you ran toward something instead of just away from something. You could have given up, could have let them make you believe what they said. But you got on a train or a stage or whatever brought you out here and you started over. That takes strength, Katherine. That takes being somebody, no matter what anyone says." Katherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd been holding herself together for so long, being strong because she had no other choice, that having someone acknowledge it felt like a weight lifting. "I just wanted to survive," she managed. "Surviving is harder than people think. And you're doing more than that now. You're building something. Maybe it's small, maybe it's just a job cooking for a rancher and his hands, but it's yours. Nobody can take that from you unless you let them." They talked until the coffee grew cold, sharing small pieces of themselves in the darkness. Ethan told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the dream of owning his own land that had driven him since childhood. Katherine found herself sharing more than she'd intended, about her mother's laugh, about the books she'd loved to read when she could find them, about the small kindnesses that had kept her going through the hard years. When Katherine finally retired to her room, she lay in the darkness listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the scrubland, the creak of the house settling. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Katherine found herself embracing. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, feeding the men hearty meals of eggs, biscuits, fried potatoes, and whatever else she could create from the supplies on hand. After breakfast, while the men went about their work, she cleaned the house, tended the vegetable garden, and began preparations for the midday meal. The work was hard, but it was honest, and Katherine discovered a sense of purpose she'd been missing. She also discovered that she enjoyed watching Ethan work from the kitchen window. The way he moved with easy confidence around the horses, the patience he showed when training the young ones, the quiet authority he had over the ranch and the men who worked for him. Ethan was different from any man Katherine had known. He didn't try to impress her or make himself seem bigger than he was. He simply worked hard, treated everyone fairly, and had a way of making Katherine feel valued that was entirely new to her experience. 2 weeks into her tenure at the ranch, a rattlesnake found its way into the chicken coop. Katherine heard the commotion and rushed out to find the hens in a panic. She'd grabbed a hoe from the garden and was trying to work up the courage to go after the snake when Ethan appeared. "Step back," he said calmly, taking the hoe from her hands. He dispatched the snake with quick efficiency, then checked each hen to make sure none had been bitten. "How did you know to come?" Katherine asked, her heart still racing. Heard the chickens from the barn. They don't make that kind of noise unless something's wrong. He smiled at her, and Katherine felt warmth spread through her chest. You were going to go after it yourself. Couldn't just let it kill the chickens. Brave. Maybe a little foolish, but brave. The way Ethan said it made it sound like a compliment. That evening, as had become their habit, they sat on the porch after dinner. The monsoon season had started, and clouds were building over the mountains, promising rain. "Tell me about your family," Katherine said, feeling bold. "You mentioned your father, but you never talk about anyone else." Ethan was quiet for so long Katherine thought he might not answer. "My mother was the daughter of a rancher up in the Texas Panhandle. She was supposed to marry some banker's son, someone respectable and settled. Instead, she fell in love with my father, who was just a cowhand with nothing to his name but a good horse and big dreams. Her family disowned her when she married him. That must have been hard for her. I think it was, though she never complained. She used to say that love was worth more than money or status, that being with someone who truly valued you was the only wealth that mattered." Ethan's voice was soft with memory. "My father spent his whole life trying to prove her right, trying to build something worthy of her sacrifice. When he finally saved enough to buy a little land, she only got to enjoy it for 2 years before the fever took her. But he did it," Katherine said. "He built something, and you've built on it. She would have been proud." "I hope so." Ethan turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were intense. "That's why I understand a little of what you're feeling, Katherine. My mother gave up everything to be with my father, and people called her foolish, said she'd thrown away her life for nothing. But she knew her worth, even when everyone else forgot it. The first drops of rain began to fall fat and warm, raising the scent of dust and sage. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "We should go in," Ethan said, but neither of them moved. "I like the rain," Katherine said softly. "Me too." They sat together as the storm rolled in, watching lightning fork across the sky, feeling the temperature drop as the rain intensified. Katherine felt something shifting between them, a growing awareness that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Over the following weeks, that awareness only deepened. Katherine found herself looking for excuses to bring water out to Ethan when he was working in the corrals. Ethan started finding reasons to come back to the house during the day, checking if Katherine needed anything from town, if the stove was working properly, if she'd seen any more snakes. Jack and Tom noticed, of course. One afternoon, while Katherine was hanging laundry, Jack approached with a grin. "Boss is different since you came," he said conversationally. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't. He smiles more. Actually seems to enjoy being here instead of just working himself into the ground. That's a good thing, Miss Katherine. He deserves some happiness." Tom, passing by with a saddle that needed mending, added his 2 cents. Never seen him care so much about whether the house was clean or if dinner was ready on time. Man smitten. "You two are impossible," Katherine said, but she couldn't quite hide her smile. The truth was, Katherine was falling for Ethan Vance, and she didn't know what to do about it. Her past had taught her that opening her heart meant risking pain, that trusting men led to disappointment and hurt. But Ethan kept proving himself different day after day, in small ways and large. When Katherine mentioned wanting to read, but having finished the one book she owned, Ethan brought her 3 books from his own small collection. When she admired the wildflowers growing near the creek, he showed up the next day with a jar full of them for the kitchen table. When a difficult mare he'd been training finally accepted a saddle, he came to get Katherine specifically so she could see, wanting to share the moment with her. 6 weeks after Katherine arrived at the ranch, everything changed. She'd gone into Bisbee with Ethan to collect supplies, her first trip back to town since leaving. They'd just finished loading the wagon when a voice called out. "Well, look who it is. The little nobody from the desert rose." Katherine turned to find Cyrus Webb, the saloon owner, standing with two other men. Webb was drunk, his face flushed and his eyes mean. "I'm not looking for trouble, Mr. Webb," Katherine said quietly. "Trouble seems to find you anyway, doesn't it? Running out on your job, leaving me in a bad spot." Webb stepped closer and Katherine could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You owe me, girl. She doesn't owe you anything." Ethan's voice was cold and he'd positioned himself between Katherine and Webb. "And I suggest you move along." Webb looked Ethan up and down, calculating. "This your woman now, Vance. Took my leftovers." Ethan's fist connected with Webb's jaw before Katherine even saw him move. The saloon owner went down hard and his two companions scrambled back, hands raised. "We don't want trouble," one of them said quickly. "Then take your friend and get out of here," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. They dragged Webb away and Ethan turned to Katherine, his expression softening immediately. "Are you all right?" Katherine was shaking, but not from fear. She was angry, furious at Webb for his words, at the assumption that she was something to be owned and passed around. But she was also moved by how quickly Ethan had defended her, how thoroughly he'd shut down Webb's disrespect. "I'm fine," she managed. "You didn't have to hit him." "Yes, I did." Ethan's jaw was tight. "Nobody talks about you like that. Nobody." They finished their shopping in silence, but as they drove back toward the ranch, Katherine felt her composure crumbling. The encounter had shaken loose all the feelings she'd been trying to ignore, all the fear and self-doubt that still lived inside her. "Can you stop for a moment?" she asked suddenly. Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt on a stretch of road with nothing around but desert and sky. "What's wrong?" "I need to tell you something." Katherine's hands twisted in her lap. "You need to know what you're getting if you're going to keep defending me, keep acting like I'm worth something." "Katherine, please let me finish." She took a breath. "After my mother died, I had nobody. My father had abandoned us years before, and we had no other family. I was 15 years old and alone. I did what I had to do to survive. I worked wherever I could, and some of those places weren't respectable. Some of the work I did wasn't respectable." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The man in Missouri, the one who wanted to marry me, he knew about my past. He thought that made me his, thought I should be grateful he'd want me despite everything. When I said no, he told everyone, made sure the whole town knew exactly what kind of woman I was." She forced herself to look at Ethan, to see the disgust or disappointment she expected to find. Instead, his eyes were gentle, sad, but not judgmental. "You know what I see when I look at you," he said softly. "I see a woman who's fought for every single thing she has. I see someone who's been knocked down and got back up, who's survived things that would have broken weaker people. I see strength and kindness and courage." He reached out and took her hand. "I don't care about your past, Katherine. I care about who you are now, and who you are now is extraordinary." "I'm nobody," Katherine whispered, the words that had haunted her for so long finally spoken aloud. "That's what they all said. That's what I am, just a nobody." "You're somebody to me," Ethan said, his voice fierce with emotion. "And that's everything." The words broke something open inside Katherine. She felt tears spilling down her cheeks, years of pain and shame and loneliness finally finding release. Ethan pulled her into his arms, and she let herself cry against his chest while he held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Katherine pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Ethan's thumb gently wiped away the remaining tears from her cheek. "You've been carrying all of that alone for too long. You really don't care about my past, Katherine. I care about you, the whole of you, including your past, because it made you who you are. But I don't judge you for it. I could never judge you for doing what you had to do to survive. They sat there in the wagon in the middle of the Arizona desert, and Katherine felt something fundamental shift inside her. For the first time in her adult life, she felt seen, truly seen, and accepted exactly as she was. "I'm falling in love with you," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Ethan's smile was slow and warm, transforming his whole face. "Well, that's convenient, because I've been in love with you since you threatened to go after that rattlesnake with a hoe." That's a strange moment to fall in love. Maybe. But that's when I knew for certain. You were scared, but you were going to do it anyway to protect something you cared about. That's who you are, Katherine. Someone who fights for what matters. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Katherine felt like she was finally coming home after years of wandering. The ride back to the ranch was different, charged with possibility and hope. Katherine sat close to Ethan on the wagon seat, their hands linked, watching the landscape roll by with new eyes. This was her home now, truly. Not just a place she was staying, but home. Jack and Tom took one look at them when they returned and made themselves scarce, claiming they needed to check the fence line on the far pasture. Ethan helped Katherine unload the supplies, and they worked together in the kitchen, hands brushing, stealing kisses between putting away flour and sugar and coffee. "I should start dinner," Katherine said eventually, though she made no move to step away from where Ethan had her pressed against the counter. "Probably," Ethan agreed, his lips finding the sensitive spot below her ear that made her shiver. "The men will be hungry. They can wait." But eventually, propriety won out, and Katherine began preparing the evening meal while Ethan sat at the table, ostensibly reviewing the ranch accounts, but mostly just watching her move around the kitchen. "I want to marry you," he said suddenly. Katherine nearly dropped the pot she was holding. "What?" "I want to marry you. I know it's fast, and if you want to wait, I understand. But I know what I want, and I want you, Katherine. I want to wake up with you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life." Katherine set the pot down carefully and turned to face him. "People will talk. They'll say things about me, about my past. Let them talk. I don't care about people who don't matter. The people who do matter, the ones who know you, they'll see what I see." "And what do you see?" Katherine needed to hear it again, needed to believe it. Ethan stood and crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "I see the woman I love. I see my future. I see home." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "Say yes, Katherine. Please say yes." "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 3 weeks later by the circuit preacher who passed through Bisbee once a month. It was a small ceremony, just Jack and Tom as witnesses, held in the main room of the ranch house with wildflowers Katherine had gathered decorating the table. Katherine wore her best dress, which wasn't much, but Ethan looked at her like she was wearing silk and diamonds. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ethan kissed her with such tenderness that Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he whispered. The celebration was simple but joyful. Katherine had made a special dinner, roasted chicken and her best biscuits, a dried apple pie that made Tom declare it the best thing he'd ever tasted. Jack produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving, and they toasted to the couple's happiness until the bottle was empty, and everyone was warm with good food and drink. When the hands finally retired to the bunkhouse, Ethan took Katherine's hand and led her to the bedroom he'd been preparing for the past 3 weeks. He'd built a new, larger bed frame and bought a proper mattress from a furniture maker in Bisbee. Clean white curtains hung at the window, and the lamp cast a warm glow over everything. "I want you to know," Ethan said, his voice serious, "that we don't have to do anything tonight. I know there might be difficult memories, and I want this to be right for you." Catherine's heart swelled with love for this careful, considerate man. "I want to be with you, truly with you. What I did before, that was survival. This is different. This is choosing to share myself with someone I love." They came together slowly, tenderly, Ethan taking his time to make sure Katherine felt safe and cherished. When they finally joined, Katherine felt something heal inside her, some wounded part of herself finally finding peace. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Katherine's head on Ethan's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I never thought I could have this," she said softly. "A home, someone who loves me. I never let myself hope for it." "You have it now," Ethan said, his arms tightening around her. "You have me, and I have you, and that's all we need." The months that followed were the happiest of Katherine's life. She threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, sewing new curtains for the windows, planting flowers near the porch, coaxing the vegetable garden into greater productivity. She learned to help with some of the ranch work, became proficient enough at riding that Ethan trusted her to help move cattle from one pasture to another. The townspeople of Bisbee, when Katherine went in with Ethan for supplies, were a mixed lot. Some were kind, welcoming her as Mrs. Vance. Others were cold, remembering the girl who'd worked at the Desert Rose and making assumptions about what that meant. Katherine learned to hold her head high and ignore the whispers, secure in Ethan's love and her own sense of worth. One afternoon, about 4 months after their wedding, Katherine was in the general store when she overheard two women talking. "That's Ethan Vance's wife," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Used to work at that saloon. Can you imagine? What was he thinking?" "Probably wasn't thinking with his head," the other replied with a nasty laugh. Katherine felt the old shame try to rise up, but she pushed it down. She thought about what Ethan would say, how he'd remind her that small minds made small judgments, that the opinions of gossips didn't matter. She turned to face the women directly. "Good afternoon, ladies. Yes, I'm Katherine Vance. I did work at the Desert Rose, washing dishes and serving drinks to earn honest money. Before that, I worked in a laundry, and before that, I cleaned houses. I've worked hard my whole life, and I'm not ashamed of anything I've done to survive. My husband knows my past, and he loves me anyway. Can your husband say they know the real you and love you despite it?" She didn't wait for an answer, simply paid for her purchases and walked out with her head high. When she told Ethan about it that evening, he laughed and pulled her into his arms. "That's my wife," he said proudly. "Strong and brave and not willing to let anyone make her feel small." Winter came to Arizona, which mostly meant cooler temperatures and occasional rain rather than the snow Katherine remembered from Missouri. She threw herself into preparing the house for the season, canning vegetables from the garden, making sure they had ample firewood, sewing warmer clothes for the coming months. It was during this time that Katherine began to suspect she might be pregnant. At first, she dismissed it, told herself she was imagining things. But when 2 months passed with no monthly bleeding and she found herself sick in the mornings, she could no longer deny it. The realization filled her with a complicated mix of joy and fear. She wanted Ethan's child, wanted to give him the family he deserved. But she was also terrified. What if something went wrong? What if she wasn't a good mother? What if the child inherited her cursed luck rather than Ethan's steady goodness? She was still trying to work up the courage to tell Ethan when he figured it out himself. They were in the kitchen, and Katherine had just rushed outside, overcome with nausea. When she came back in, pale and shaking, Ethan was watching her with knowing eyes. "How long?" he asked gently. "I think about 2 months. I was going to tell you, I just wasn't sure how." Ethan crossed to her and knelt down, placing his hands on her still flat stomach. "This is the best thing you could have told me. We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Katherine needed to hear it. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm thrilled. I'm terrified. I'm grateful. I'm all of it at once. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "We're going to be parents, Katherine." The fear didn't completely disappear, but it eased, made manageable by Ethan's unwavering support and excitement. As Katherine's pregnancy progressed, Ethan became almost comically protective. He insisted she rest more, refused to let her lift anything heavy, and worried constantly about her health. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Katherine told him one afternoon when he'd forbidden her from hanging laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my wife. My wife is precious and should be taking it easy. Your wife is going to go crazy if you don't let her do something useful." They compromised, with Katherine taking on lighter tasks and Ethan hiring a woman from town to help with the heavier housework. Mrs. Chen was a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, and she was grateful for the work and extra money. She and Katherine quickly became friends, and Mrs. Chen's practical wisdom about pregnancy and childbirth helped ease some of Katherine's fears. Spring arrived, and with it, Katherine's belly swelled noticeably. Ethan loved to place his hand there and feel the baby kick, his face lighting up with wonder every time. "You hope for a boy or a girl?" Katherine asked one evening. "Healthy, that's all I hope for, a healthy baby and a healthy wife." Ethan kissed her stomach. "Though if it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father, Samuel. And if it's a girl, you should choose. Name her after your mother." Katherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah. My mother's name was Sarah. Sarah Vance. I like it." The baby came on a warm day in early June, arriving after 16 hours of labor that left Katherine exhausted and Ethan a nervous wreck. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, handled everything with calm efficiency, finally placing a squalling infant in Katherine's arms as dawn broke. "A boy," she announced. "Strong and healthy." Ethan, who'd been banished to the porch during the worst of the labor, was finally allowed back in. He looked at Katherine and their son with such pure love that Katherine felt her heart might burst. "Samuel," she said softly, touching the baby's perfect tiny hand. "Samuel Vance. He's beautiful. You're beautiful. You're both so beautiful." Ethan's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Katherine. Thank you for this, for him, for everything." The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and overwhelming, but they were also filled with a joy Katherine had never imagined. Watching Ethan hold their son, seeing this strong rancher reduced to making silly faces to earn a baby's smile, made Katherine fall even more deeply in love with her husband. Jack and Tom were besotted with the baby, competing to see who could make Samuel laugh first, arguing over who got to hold him during their brief breaks from ranch work. Even the usually stoic Tom became a puddle of sentiment when the baby grasped his finger with a tiny fist. As Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler, Katherine watched him become a perfect blend of herself and Ethan. He had Ethan's green eyes and dark hair, but Katherine's stubborn determination and quick mind. By the time he was 2, he was already following Ethan around the ranch, insisting on helping with everything from feeding the chickens to brushing the horses. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management, growing from a modest operation to one of the more successful cattle ranches in the area. Katherine's cooking became legendary among the other ranchers, and she often found herself preparing food for community gatherings and church socials. When Samuel was 3, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she told Ethan immediately, and his reaction was just as joyful as the first time. Their daughter, Sarah, was born on a cool October evening, arriving much faster than her brother had. She had Katherine's blonde hair and a set of lungs that announced her presence to the entire ranch. "Now I have 3 beautiful people to protect," Ethan said, cradling Sarah while Samuel climbed onto the bed to meet his new sister. "Baby," Samuel declared, poking her gently. "My baby." "Our baby," Katherine corrected, but she was smiling. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning everything Ethan could teach him about ranching and horses. Sarah proved to have her mother's gift in the kitchen and her father's way with animals, able to calm even the most nervous horse with patience and gentle words. Katherine never forgot where she came from or the journey that had brought her to this life. Sometimes, when she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors, she thought about the frightened girl who'd fled Missouri thinking she was nothing, worth nothing. That girl had been wrong. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan gave Katherine a gift. It was a small leather journal, beautiful and expensive, with her initials tooled into the cover. "For your thoughts," he said. "So you can write down everything you're feeling, everything you want to remember." Katherine opened it to find Ethan had already written on the first page. "To my wife, Katherine, you were never nobody. You were always somebody, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. You are somebody to me, to our children, to everyone whose life you've touched. You are everything." Katherine felt tears streaming down her face as she read. "Ethan, this is too much. It's not nearly enough." He pulled her close. "I love you, Katherine. I will love you every day for the rest of my life." The children grew, as children do. Samuel, at 16, was already taller than his father and took on more responsibility around the ranch. Sarah, at 13, had her mother's kindness and her father's determination, already talking about becoming a teacher so she could help other children learn. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts that tested the ranch's resources, cattle diseases that decimated the herd, and the constant challenges of making a living from the unforgiving Arizona land. But through it all, Katherine and Ethan faced each obstacle together, their love deepening with each passing year. When Katherine turned 40, she looked back on her life with a sense of profound gratitude. The scared 22-year-old who'd arrived in Bisbee thinking she was running away had actually been running toward something, toward the life she was meant to live, toward the love she deserved. Ethan, now 48, had a bit more gray in his hair and more lines around his eyes, but he was still the man who'd told her she was somebody when she felt like nobody. He still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. They added on to the house as the years passed, building more rooms, a larger kitchen, a proper parlor for receiving guests. The ranch itself expanded, and Ethan took on more hands to help manage the larger herd. Jack eventually married a woman from town and moved into his own small house on the property. Tom, content in his bachelor ways, remained in the bunkhouse, now serving as foreman and Ethan's right hand. Samuel, at 20, announced his intention to marry Lucy Taylor, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Katherine loved Lucy immediately, recognizing in her the same strength and determination she'd once seen in herself. The wedding was a grand affair by ranch standards, with half the county attending. Sarah, showing no interest in marriage yet, had indeed pursued teaching, traveling to Tucson for training and returning to open a small school in Bisbee. She lived in town during the week, but came home every weekend, bringing stories of her students and the satisfaction of work she loved. Katherine's reputation had long since ceased to be a subject of gossip. She was known now as Mrs. Vance, The capable ranch wife who could cook a meal for 50 people without breaking a sweat, who could nurse a sick calf back to health, who gave generously to those in need. The woman who'd worked at the Desert Rose was a distant memory, relevant to no one except Katherine herself, and even to her, it was just another part of the journey that had brought her home. On a spring evening, with Katherine now 45 and Ethan 53, they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they'd done countless times before. Samuel and Lucy lived in a house they'd built on the far edge of the property, and the sound of their twin boys playing drifted on the breeze. Sarah was in town, but she'd be home for Sunday dinner as always. "You ever think about how different our lives could have been?" Katherine asked, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. "Sometimes. But then I remember that every choice, every hardship, every moment of joy brought us here to this exact place. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the hard parts. Especially not the hard parts. They taught us what we were capable of surviving, what we were capable of building together." Katherine thought about the girl she'd been, convinced she was nobody, worth nothing. She thought about the woman she'd become, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, someone whose life had meaning and purpose. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you too." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "You're somebody to me, Katherine Vance. You always have been. You always will be." They sat together as the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over them since that first night when Ethan had offered her a job and a chance at a new life. The desert stretched out before them, beautiful and harsh and home. Katherine had learned many lessons in her 45 years, but perhaps the most important was this: being somebody had nothing to do with what other people thought of you, and everything to do with knowing your own worth. She'd found that worth reflected in Ethan's eyes, in her children's laughter, in the life they'd built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. The wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of desert flowers and rain on the distant horizon. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight this moment was perfect. Katherine had everything she'd ever needed, everything she'd never dared to dream of when she'd stepped off that stage in Bisbee all those years ago. She was somebody. She'd always been somebody. And that knowledge, that certainty, was indeed everything. Years continued to pass, marked by the cycles of the ranch and the rhythms of family life. Katherine found herself taking on the role of matriarch, not through any deliberate effort, but simply because that's what happened when you built a life and a family in a place. The Vance Ranch became a gathering spot for the community, with Katherine's Sunday dinners becoming something of a local institution. Samuel proved to be as capable a rancher as his father, taking on more of the daily operations as Ethan began to slow down. The twins, named Daniel and Thomas after no one in particular, but because Lucy had liked the names, showed early promise of continuing the family tradition. They were 6 now, wild and energetic, filling the ranch with the same kind of chaos Samuel had brought at that age. Sarah, at 23, finally met someone who captured her heart, a young lawyer from Tucson named Michael Brennan. He was smart and kind, with a deep respect for Sarah's independence and her passion for teaching. When he asked for her hand, he asked Sarah first, then came to Ethan and Katherine not for permission but to express his intentions and hopes. "I love your daughter," he told them, sitting in the parlor with his hat in his hands. "I want to build a life with her, support her dreams, and be a man worthy of the family she comes from." Katherine liked him immediately. Ethan took a bit more convincing, but by the end of the evening, even he had to admit that Michael seemed like a good man. The wedding was held at the ranch, with Sarah looking radiant in a dress Katherine had helped her sew. Watching her daughter marry for love, seeing the way Michael looked at Sarah like she hung the moon, Katherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her children had grown up knowing their worth, secure in themselves in a way she hadn't been at their age. That felt like perhaps her greatest achievement. Katherine was 50 when she became sick. It started as a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, then developed into a weakness that left her exhausted after the smallest tasks. The doctor from Bisbee came out to examine her, his face grave when he delivered the diagnosis. "Your lungs, Mrs. Vance. I suspect it's from years of breathing in dust and smoke from the stove. It's not uncommon in women who have worked as hard as you have." "How bad is it?" Ethan asked, his hand tight around Katherine's. "It's not good. There's no cure I can offer. Rest will help, avoiding the dust and smoke, but the damage is done." The news hit the family hard. Sarah wanted to quit teaching and come home to care for her mother. Samuel looked stricken, like a little boy again rather than a grown man with a family of his own. Ethan seemed to age a decade overnight, but Katherine refused to become an invalid. She modified her routine, letting Mrs. Chen take over more of the cooking, spending more time resting, but she wouldn't stop living. She still sat on the porch every evening with Ethan. She still read stories to her grandsons. She still tended her small flower garden when she had the energy. "I'm not ready to give up," she told Ethan one night. "I've fought too hard for this life to surrender it easily." "Then we fight together," Ethan said fiercely. "We've faced everything else together. This is no different." For 2 years, Katherine's health remained stable. She learned to manage her limitations, to rest when needed, to accept help without feeling diminished. She focused on the moments of joy, watching her grandsons grow, seeing Sarah's school thrive, celebrating when Samuel and Lucy announced they were expecting another child. That third grandchild, a girl named Katherine after her grandmother, arrived on a beautiful spring morning. When they placed the baby in Katherine's arms, she felt a sense of completion, of her story coming full circle. "She's perfect," Katherine whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek. "Absolutely perfect." Lucy smiled, tired but happy. "We hope she grows up to be as strong as her namesake." "Stronger," Katherine said. "I hope she never has to fight as hard as I did. I hope she always knows she's somebody." When Katherine turned 52, she knew her time was growing short. The illness had progressed despite her best efforts, and she was spending more time in bed than up. But she was content, surrounded by the family she'd created, loved beyond measure. Ethan rarely left her side. He'd handed over the ranch operations entirely to Samuel, devoting himself to caring for Katherine. He read to her, brought her wildflowers, held her hand through the bad nights when breathing became difficult. "I'm sorry," Katherine said one evening, her voice weak. "I'm sorry to leave you." "Don't apologize for being human," Ethan said gently. "We knew from the beginning that our time was limited. Everyone's is. We just have to be grateful for what we had." "Were you grateful? Even knowing it would end like this?" "Katherine, meeting you, loving you, building this life together, it's been the greatest privilege of my existence. I would do it all again, exactly the same, even knowing the pain of losing you. You gave me everything that matters." Sarah and Samuel came to visit every day, bringing the grandchildren. The house was full of life and love, and Katherine drank it in, storing up memories for whatever came next. On a quiet morning in late September, with Ethan holding her hand and autumn sunlight streaming through the window, Katherine Vance took her last breath. She went peacefully, without pain, a small smile on her face. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire county. Katherine had touched more lives than she'd ever realized, through kindness and generosity, through the example she'd set of quiet strength and dignity. The woman who'd arrived in Bisbee thinking she was nobody was mourned as somebody precious, somebody irreplaceable. Ethan stood at her grave, Sarah on one side and Samuel on the other, and spoke the eulogy himself. "My wife believed for too long that she was nobody," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Life had taught her that she didn't matter, that she wasn't worth anything. But she was wrong. Katherine Vance mattered to everyone here. She mattered to the children she fed when their families were struggling. She mattered to the neighbors she helped when sickness struck. She mattered to her students, her friends, her community. His voice broke slightly. "She mattered to me more than anything in this world. She was somebody, and that was everything." The years after Katherine's death were hard for Ethan. He moved through his days with a sense of going through the motions, living because he had to rather than because he wanted to. Samuel and Sarah worried about him, but they understood that grief took time. Slowly, painfully, Ethan learned to live with the loss. He found purpose in helping Samuel run the ranch, in spending time with his grandchildren, in maintaining the garden Katherine had loved. He took to writing in the journal he'd given Katherine for their anniversary, filling it with memories and stories of their life together. When little Katherine was old enough to understand, Ethan told her about her namesake. "Your grandmother," he said, holding the 6-year-old on his lap, "was the strongest person I ever knew. She faced things that would have broken most people, but she never gave up. She taught me that who you are matters more than where you come from, that love can heal even the deepest wounds." "I wish I could have known her better," little Katherine said. "She knew you, sweetheart. She held you and loved you, and she's part of who you are. Her strength lives on in you." Ethan lived another 15 years after Katherine's death, seeing his grandchildren grow, welcoming great-grandchildren, watching the ranch thrive under Samuel's management. But everyone who knew him understood that part of him had died with Katherine, that he was simply waiting to be reunited with the love of his life. When Ethan Vance died at the age of 75, peacefully in his sleep, it was almost a relief. He'd lived a good life, a full life, but he'd been ready to go home to Katherine for a long time. They buried him next to his wife, under the Arizona sky they'd both loved, on a ridge overlooking the ranch they'd built together. Sarah and Samuel, now middle-aged themselves, stood with their children and grandchildren, mourning but also celebrating a love story that had defined their family. "He loved her so much," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Even after all these years, he never stopped loving her." "She loved him just as much," Samuel replied. "They were lucky to find each other." In the years that followed, the story of Ethan and Katherine Vance became something of a legend in the area. People told it to their children as an example of true love, of how two people who started with nothing could build something lasting and beautiful. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations. Samuel's sons took it over when he retired, and their children after them. Each generation heard the story of their great-great-grandparents, of the woman who thought she was nobody and the man who showed her she was somebody. Little Katherine, who'd grown into a formidable woman in her own right, became a doctor, one of the first women physicians in Arizona. She never married, but she had a rich and full life, dedicating herself to healing others. She often said that her grandmother's strength lived in her, that the example of Katherine and Ethan's love had taught her that being true to yourself was more important than conforming to anyone else's expectations. The journal Ethan had filled with memories of Katherine was preserved and passed down through the family. Future generations read his words and understood the depth of what their ancestors had shared. "She thought she was running away," one entry read, "but she was running toward everything she was meant to be, toward me, toward our life together, toward the family we would create." Katherine believed she was nobody, but from the moment I met her, I knew the truth. She was somebody extraordinary. She was everything I ever wanted, everything I ever needed. Loving her, being loved by her, that was the greatest gift of my life. Another entry, written near the end of Ethan's life, reflected on what their love had meant. People ask me sometimes how I've managed so long without her. The truth is, I haven't. Katherine is with me every day in every memory, every lesson she taught me, every moment of beauty I see in this world we love together. She made me a better man. She gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be grateful for every sunrise. I'm not afraid of death because I know she's waiting for me, probably with her hands on her hips wondering what took me so long. The house on the Vance ranch still stands, maintained by the family as a piece of living history. The porch where Katherine and Ethan spent countless evenings still offers a view of the Arizona desert and mountains. The kitchen where Katherine worked her magic still produces meals for family gatherings. The bedroom where they loved and laughed and raised their children still holds the bed Ethan built for their wedding night. Visitors to the ranch, family and friends alike, often comment on the feeling of the place. There's a warmth there, a sense of love and history that seems to permeate the very walls. It's as if the love Ethan and Katherine shared left an imprint on the land itself, a testament to the power of two people choosing each other, believing in each other, building something lasting together. The graves on the ridge, side by side under the open sky, are never without fresh flowers. Someone from the family always makes sure of that, honoring the memory of the couple who started it all. The inscription on Katherine's headstone reads, "Katherine Malone Vance, beloved wife, mother, and friend, she was somebody." Ethan's reads, "Ethan Vance, devoted husband and father, he knew what mattered." Between them, a shared stone carries a final inscription. Together they were everything. And that was the truth of it, the simple and profound truth that echoed through generations. Katherine, who'd started life believing she was nobody, had become somebody through sheer determination and courage. Ethan, who could have chosen an easier path, had chosen instead to love completely and without reservation. Together, they'd created a legacy that extended far beyond themselves, a family built on foundations of love and mutual respect, and the radical belief that every person has worth. Their story became a touchstone for the family, a reminder in hard times that strength could be found even in the darkest moments, that love could heal, that being true to yourself and those you loved mattered more than wealth or status or what others thought. Young women in the family, facing their own struggles and doubts, were told Katherine's story. They learned that their great-great-great-grandmother had once worked in places she wasn't proud of, had been told she was worthless, had believed for too long that she deserved nothing better. They learned how she'd found the courage to leave, to start over, to accept love when it was offered. They learned that your past didn't define your future unless you let it. Young men learned about Ethan, about a man who valued character over reputation, who saw past surfaces to the truth beneath. They learned about commitment and loyalty, about defending those you loved, about building something lasting through steady work and unwavering dedication. The love story of Katherine and Ethan Vance, the nobody who became somebody and the rancher who always knew she was everything, lived on. It lived in the family they created, in the values they instilled, in the ranch that still stood as a monument to their shared dream. It lived in every couple who chose love over convenience, in every person who refused to let their past define them, in every act of kindness that acknowledged another person's inherent worth. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind, not wealth or fame, but the simple and profound impact of a love that changed lives, that rippled out through generations, that proved beyond any doubt that being somebody to someone, that loving and being loved, was indeed everything that mattered. The story that began with a shotgun blast in Bisbee, Arizona in 1884 never really ended. It continued in the lives Katherine and Ethan touched, in the family they created, in the love they shared. It was a story of hope found in unexpected places, of healing through acceptance, of building a life worth living through courage and commitment. It was a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that nobody who loved and was loved in return was truly nobody at all. Everyone was somebody to someone. And for Katherine and Ethan Vance, being everything to each other had been more than enough. It had been perfect.